Hey, stop scrolling for a second. This one's different. I need you to sit with this for a moment, because what you're about to hear happened in front of 300 wedding guests, under crystal chandeliers, in the kind of ballroom most people only see in magazines. A maid. Just a maid, nobody important, nobody anyone would ever suspect, walked up to the bride in her $300,000 wedding gown, and shoved her face straight into the wedding cake. Screams. A groom frozen in shock, knife still in his hand. And the maid just stood there, glass vial raised in the air, staring the bride down like she wasn't afraid of a single person in that room. Everyone thought she'd lost her mind. Nobody, not one person, knew what she was actually holding in that little bottle. By the end of this story, you won't be thinking about the cake at all. Hey, welcome back, and if this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found us. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and which country you belong to. I read every single comment and I love knowing who's out there with me tonight. What you're about to hear is one of those stories that stays with you long after it ends. A story about love, betrayal, and one woman who was brave enough to risk everything for the truth. Starts like a fairy tale. Does not stay that way. Get comfortable because you're not going to want to look away from this one. Nobody in that ballroom knew the maid had been planning this moment for 6 months. Her name was Amara Bell, 28 years old, and for the last year she had worked as a private household maid for one of the wealthiest families in Boston, the Whitfields. Amara wasn't the kind of woman people noticed. She moved quietly through marble hallways, folded linen napkins into perfect triangles, and kept her head down. That was the job. Be invisible. Be efficient. Never speak unless spoken to. The man she worked for was Daniel Whitfield, 32 years old, heir to a shipping and logistics empire his grandfather built from nothing in the 1960s. Daniel wasn't like the stereotype people imagined when they heard the word billionaire. He didn't flaunt his money. He still remembered the names of every member of his household staff, still said good morning to Amara every single day, still tipped the delivery drivers in cash out of his own pocket. People who worked for him respected him. People who knew him loved him. And 6 months before that wedding day, Daniel had gotten engaged to a woman named Victoria Lane. Victoria was 29, stunning, magnetic, the kind of woman who lit up a room the second she walked into it. She came from old money in Connecticut, or at least that's what everyone believed. She had impeccable manners, an art history degree from a prestigious university, and a laugh that made every man in the room turn their head. Daniel had fallen for her fast. Faster than his friends expected, faster than his late mother would have advised, if she'd still been alive to see it. Amara noticed things, though. Maids always do. They see the parts of a house that guests never see. The moments when the mask slips. Started small. Victoria snapping at the housekeeper over a wrinkled tablecloth, then turning sweet the second Daniel walked into the room. Victoria making calls late at night, stepping out onto the balcony, voice low, laughing in a way she never laughed with Daniel. Victoria going through Daniel's study when she thought no one was watching, opening drawers, photographing documents on her phone. At first, Amara told herself it wasn't her business. She needed this job. She had a younger brother back home in Ohio she was helping put through community college, an aging grandmother whose medical bills didn't stop coming, and rent that didn't care about her moral dilemmas. Getting involved in the personal life of her employer's fiancé was the fastest way to get fired, or worse. But then, 4 months before the wedding, Amara overheard something she couldn't unhear. She had been polishing silver in the pantry just off the kitchen, hidden behind a half-open door, when Victoria walked in on a phone call she thought no one could hear. "Relax," Victoria said, voice sharp and cold in a way Amara had never heard from her before. "The prenup doesn't matter if he's dead before the divorce. Life insurance pays out clean. No lawyers, no fighting over assets. Just a grieving widow who inherits everything. Amara froze, silver polish rag still in her hand. Heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. "I'm not saying tomorrow," Victoria continued, softer now, almost amused. "I'm saying after the wedding. After the insurance policy locks in. Give it 8-10 months. Something slow. Something that looks natural. Heart issues run in his family anyway, don't they? Nobody's going to look twice." The call ended. Footsteps clicked away across the marble floor. And Amara stood alone in that pantry, shaking, holding a piece of silver in her hand and a piece of knowledge she now realized could destroy her entire life if she said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Because who would believe her? A maid, accusing the golden bride-to-be of planning a murder. Victoria had spent a year building a reputation as sweet, elegant, beloved. Amara had spent a year being furniture. If she went to Daniel with an accusation like that and had no proof, she wouldn't just lose her job. She'd be branded jealous, unstable, a liar trying to sabotage a happy family. Victoria's family had lawyers. Amara had a bus pass. That night, Amara went home to her small studio apartment and didn't sleep at all. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, staring at the wall, replaying Victoria's voice over and over in her head. Something slow. Something that looks natural. She thought about Daniel, really thought about him. The way he'd stopped his car once in the rain, just to help an elderly stranger carry groceries. The way he quietly paid for a hospital bill for one of the gardeners without ever telling anyone, until the gardener let it slip out of gratitude one afternoon. He was a good man. A genuinely good man walking straight into a trap with a ring on his finger, and no idea the woman he loved was already counting down the months until he became a payout. Amara made a decision that night that would change everything. She wasn't going to walk away. She wasn't going to stay silent and let this happen because it was easier, because it was safer, because it wasn't technically her problem. But she also knew that suspicion wasn't enough. Words against Victoria's word would get her fired within the hour. She needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. And she had no idea, sitting there in the dark with her cold coffee, just how far she'd have to go to get it. Or that 6 months later, she'd be standing in front of 300 wedding guests with a vial in her hand, about to do the most terrifying thing she'd ever done in her life. What Amara found in Victoria's purse 3 weeks later made her hands shake so badly she nearly dropped it. Over the next few weeks, Amara became someone else. On the outside, she was still the quiet maid who folded napkins into perfect triangles. On the inside, she was watching everything. Every phone call, every visitor, every unexplained errand Victoria made when Daniel wasn't home. She didn't have training for this. She wasn't a private investigator. She was a 28-year-old woman from a small town in Ohio who had learned, out of necessity, how to survive by paying close attention to people. And it turned out that skill was more useful than she ever imagined. 3 weeks after overhearing that phone call, Amara was cleaning the guest bathroom off the main hallway when Victoria left her purse on the vanity and stepped out to take a call. It was reckless of Amara, she knew that. If she got caught, there was no explanation that would save her. But something in her chest told her this might be the only window she'd get. She opened the purse. Inside, tucked beneath a makeup bag, was a small folded piece of paper. A receipt from a pharmacy 2 towns over. Not the pharmacy near the Whitfield estate, but one Victoria had clearly driven out of her way to visit. The item purchased was listed only by a prescription code. Nothing Amara could read or understand on her own. But there was something else with it, a business card. A name Amara didn't recognize. Dr. Marcus Reyes, with an address that, when Amara looked it up later that night on her phone, turned out to belong to a private clinic known for handling controversial and expensive off-book medical consultations for wealthy clients who wanted discretion above everything else. She took a photo of both items with trembling hands, put everything back exactly as she'd found it, and walked out of that bathroom like her legs belonged to someone else. That night she didn't sleep again. She sat with her laptop, searching everything she could about Dr. Marcus Reyes, piecing together fragments from old news articles and public records. What she found chilled her. Years earlier, Reyes had lost his medical license in another state after being investigated, though never formally charged, in connection with a wealthy patient's sudden and unexplained cardiac death. He had relocated, rebranded, and quietly continued seeing private clients who paid enormous fees and asked no questions. Amara now had two things: a motive spoken directly from Victoria's mouth, and a connection to a man with a documented history that should have ended his career the first time. But she still didn't have enough. A photo of a receipt and a business card wasn't proof of murder. It was proof of a doctor's visit. Any decent lawyer would tear that apart in minutes. And Amara knew it. She needed something undeniable. Something physical. Something that would exist in a moment too public, too witnessed, too impossible to explain away. So Amara began planning. Not an accusation but an exposure. If she was going to risk her entire life on this, she needed a moment when there would be no room for denial. A moment surrounded by witnesses. A moment where Victoria couldn't spin a story fast enough to save herself. The wedding was set for 6 months out. Amara realized, with a mixture of dread and clarity, that the wedding itself might be her only chance. The one moment when everyone who mattered would be in the same room, when Victoria would be at her most confident, most careless, most convinced she'd already won. Over the following months, Amara did something extraordinarily dangerous. She stayed close. She kept working. She smiled at Victoria every single day, served her coffee every single morning, all while quietly building a case piece by piece. A second pharmacy receipt she photographed in April, a torn note in Victoria's handwriting she found in a wastebasket in May that read only, "Talk to R about timing," after the toast, and most damning of all, a small unmarked glass vial Amara discovered hidden inside a cosmetics case in Victoria's dressing room in June, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious and secret. Amara didn't touch that vial. She photographed it, documented exactly where she'd found it, and left it untouched. Because she had a plan now, a plan that required that very vial to still be there on the day it mattered most. She also did something she'd never expected to do. She reached out, carefully and anonymously, to a private toxicology lab 2 states away, one that offered discreet testing for individuals with legitimate safety concerns. She couldn't test the vial without taking it, and taking it would mean revealing her hand too early. So instead, she waited and watched, and prayed she'd get one real opportunity before the wedding day to confirm what she already believed in her gut. That opportunity came 4 days before the wedding. Victoria left the house for a spa appointment, and in a moment of panic and clarity, Amara took the smallest amount from that vial she could manage without disturbing it, sealed it in a plastic bag she'd bought for exactly this purpose, and drove it herself, on her one day off, 3 hours to that private lab, paying out of her own savings for rush testing. 2 days later, 2 days before the wedding, the results came back. The substance was a slow-acting cardiac toxin, undetectable in a standard autopsy, designed to mimic natural heart failure over a period of weeks if administered in small, repeated doses. Exactly the kind of substance a disgraced doctor with a history like Marcus Reyes's would know how to source. Exactly the kind of something slow, something that looks natural Victoria had promised on that phone call 6 months earlier. Amara sat in her car outside the lab, holding that report, and cried. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to grief. Because now she knew, beyond any doubt, that in 2 days, A good man was going to marry a woman who was already planning his death. She had the proof. What she didn't have was a plan for how, exactly. A maid was supposed to stop a 300-person wedding without being dragged out in handcuffs before she ever got the chance to speak. On the morning of the wedding, Amara almost lost her nerve completely, until she saw Daniel's face. The morning of the wedding, the Whitfield estate transformed into something out of a dream. White and lavender roses covered every surface. Crystal chandeliers had been polished until they threw rainbows across the marble floor. String quartets tuned their instruments in the garden. Amara moved through it all in her uniform, carrying trays, setting tables. Her heart pounding so hard she was sure someone would hear it. She had the lab report folded and hidden in the inside pocket of her apron. She had rehearsed 100 different ways this could go. 100 different moments where she might pull Daniel aside quietly and simply hand him the evidence. Let security handle it. Let it happen away from cameras and crowds and cake. But every quiet plan collapsed the moment she actually saw Daniel that morning. She found him alone for just a few seconds in the hallway outside his dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks, practicing his vows under his breath with a small, nervous smile on his face. The kind of genuine, hopeful smile of a man who believed, completely, that he was about to marry the love of his life. He looked up and saw Amara standing there. "Big day, huh?" he said warmly, the way he always spoke to her, like she was a person, not furniture. "You've been amazing this whole week, Amara. Really. Thank you." And Amara opened her mouth to say something, anything, and found she couldn't do it. Not there. Not like that. Because she understood in that instant exactly what Victoria's family and lawyers would do the moment Amara made a quiet accusation with no audience, no proof visible to anyone else, no undeniable moment. They would isolate the claim, bury it, fire her within the hour, and quietly settle it before a single guest ever knew a wedding had almost been stopped. Victoria would simply postpone whatever timing she discussed with Dr. Reyes and try again in a year, more careful next time. Amara needed a moment nobody could erase. "You're welcome," she managed to say instead, and walked away before her voice could betray her. By 4 o'clock, the ceremony had already taken place in the garden, and 300 guests had moved into the grand ballroom for the reception. Amara worked the edges of the room, carrying trays of champagne, watching Victoria glide from table to table in her gown, glowing, radiant, playing the role of adoring bride to perfection. Watching Daniel laugh with his groomsmen, completely unaware. Watching Victoria's phone buzz once, twice, and watching her glance at it with a small, private smile before slipping it back into her clutch. Amara's chest felt like it was being crushed. She thought about her brother back in Ohio, about her grandmother's medical bills, about everything she stood to lose. She thought about the fact that in a few hours this wedding would end, everyone would go home, and the countdown Victoria had promised on that phone call would quietly begin. 8 to 10 months of something slow, something that looks natural. And by the time anyone suspected anything, Daniel Whitfield would already be dead and buried, and Victoria would already own everything. That was the moment Amara stopped being afraid. The cake was wheeled out around 7:30. 4 tiers, white and lavender, decorated with sugared roses, exactly matching the flowers throughout the room. Daniel and Victoria stood behind it, hands together on the ceremonial knife. Guests raising their phones to capture the moment. A photographer crouched for the perfect angle. Amara stepped forward from the edge of the room, the small glass vial she'd taken days earlier now clutched in her hand. Proof, physical proof, the very substance she'd had tested, still bearing traces that could be matched to whatever remained hidden in Victoria's dressing room. "Wait," Amara said, her voice cutting through the room louder and steadier than she thought herself capable of. "Before you cut that cake, everyone needs to hear this." The room didn't go silent immediately. A few guests laughed, assuming it was part of some planned surprise. Victoria's smile flickered, just barely, a crack in the porcelain. "I found this," Amara said, raising the vial high enough for the nearest tables to see. "In your fiancé's dressing room 3 weeks ago. It's a slow-acting cardiac toxin. I had it tested. I have the lab report right here." She pulled the folded paper from her apron pocket with her free hand, holding it up as well. "And 4 months ago I heard her on the phone, planning exactly when to use it. After the wedding, after your life insurance policy locked in." The room went completely, utterly silent. Victoria's face drained of color in real time, the porcelain smile shattering entirely. "This is insane," she said, laughing sharply, but her voice cracked in the middle of the word insane, and 300 guests heard it crack. "She's clearly unstable, Daniel, don't listen to this. She's probably been fired and this is some kind of revenge." "I haven't been fired," Amara said quietly. "I've been documenting this for 6 months because I was terrified nobody would believe me otherwise." Daniel had gone completely still, the ceremonial knife frozen in his hand, staring at Amara and then at Victoria with an expression that was breaking apart in real time in front of every single guest in that room. And that was the exact moment Victoria panicked. She lunged not for Amara, but for the lab report in her hand, desperate to grab it, tear it, destroy the one thing that could sink her. And in the chaos of that lunge, stumbling in her heels across the marble floor, Victoria's own momentum sent her crashing forward directly into the cake table, her face driving straight into the top tier in front of every phone camera in the room. Amara didn't push her. But in the pandemonium that followed, guests gasping, someone screaming, Victoria scrambling frosting covered and humiliated off the cake table while still shrieking denials, Amara stepped forward one final time, gripped Victoria's shoulder to stop her from lunging at Daniel with a butter knife she'd grabbed off the table in blind panic, and held her firmly still against the ruined cake until security finally reached them. That image, the maid in the lavender dress holding the bride down against a smashed wedding cake, vial raised, 300 stunned faces frozen behind them, would end up being the photograph that made international news within 24 hours. What the police found in Victoria's car that night was worse than anyone in that ballroom could have imagined. Police arrived within 11 minutes. What had begun as a wedding reception became, in the span of less than half an hour, an active criminal investigation. Guests were asked to remain in the ballroom while officers separated Victoria from the crowd, and Amara, shaking now that the adrenaline had started to fade, was asked to hand over the vial and the lab report and explain, in full, everything she had witnessed and documented over the past 6 months. Daniel stood apart from everyone, still in his tuxedo, tie loosened, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. It was Victoria's own reaction that ultimately sealed her fate that night. In her panic, before officers had even finished separating the two women, Victoria had bolted for the parking area, insisting she needed to get something from the car. And when a security guard, acting on Daniel's shaken instructions, stopped her, they found her car keys already in hand and her overnight bag, packed and hidden in her trunk since that morning, containing cash, a passport and a second, unregistered phone. On that second phone, investigators later found a string of messages between Victoria and Dr. Marcus Reyes stretching back nearly 8 months. Messages discussing dosage, timing, and the exact payout structure of Daniel's life insurance policy, which Victoria had quietly increased just 3 months into their engagement, listing herself as sole beneficiary. The lab that had tested Amara's sample was subpoenaed and confirmed everything. A second search of Victoria's dressing room, conducted with a warrant that same night, recovered the remainder of the vial exactly where Amara had first found it, along with 2 more sealed vials hidden in a lining Victoria had sewn into an old coat. Dr. Marcus Reyes was arrested 4 days later, attempting to leave the country from a private airfield 2 hours outside the city. The story exploded across every news outlet in the country within a week. Billionaire's bride arrested for attempted murder plot exposed by Maid at own wedding, ran across headlines from coast to coast. People argued online about every detail. Some accused Amara of overstepping, of playing detective when she should have simply gone to police immediately. Others called her a hero, the only person in that entire glittering room brave enough to actually see what was happening and risk everything to stop it. Daniel, for his part, never once doubted Amara after that night. In fact, in the weeks that followed, as the investigation deepened and the full extent of Victoria's plan became public, including evidence that this wasn't Reyes's first arrangement with a wealthy, unsuspecting client, Daniel came to understand something that hollowed him out completely. Amara hadn't just saved him from years of a doomed marriage. She had saved his life. He requested to see her privately, away from lawyers and reporters and the chaos still swirling around the estate. He found her in the small staff apartment on the property, still in her uniform from that night, sitting quietly with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked her, not with anger, but with genuine aching confusion. 6 months ago. Why did you carry this alone for 6 months? Amara looked up at him, exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. "Because I was a maid accusing your fiancé of murder, with nothing but a phone call I overheard," she said quietly. "Who was going to believe me over her? I needed proof. I needed a moment where nobody could look away from it. I'm sorry it had to be your wedding day. I know that doesn't make it hurt less." Daniel sat down across from her, quiet for a long moment. "You spent 6 months protecting me," he finally said, "while I spent 6 months planning a life with a person trying to end mine. You didn't have to do any of this. It wasn't your job. It wasn't your responsibility." "No," Amara agreed softly. "But you're a good man. And good men shouldn't die because everyone around them was too comfortable, or too scared to say something." Daniel didn't have a response to that. He just sat there for a long time, in the quiet of that small apartment, finally allowing himself to fully feel the weight of everything he'd almost lost. What Daniel did for Amara 3 months later left the entire town talking, but it wasn't the kind of ending anyone expected. Victoria Lane was formally charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. Dr. Marcus Reyes faced similar charges, along with a reopened investigation into the earlier death that had originally cost him his medical license. Both cases moved slowly through the courts over the following year, dragged out by expensive lawyers and endless motions, but the physical evidence, the vials, the lab results, the messages, the phone call Amara had documented in real time in a private journal she'd kept from the very beginning, was simply too overwhelming to overcome. Victoria eventually accepted a plea deal that guaranteed decades behind bars. Amara went back to a quiet life for a while. She kept working, kept sending money home to Ohio, kept believing that what she'd done was right even on the nights when the exhaustion and the trauma of it all caught up with her. She didn't do interviews at first, despite dozens of requests. She wasn't interested in fame. She'd done what she'd done because it was right, not because she wanted the world to know her name. But Daniel wasn't going to let it end there. 3 months after the wedding that never finished, Daniel Whitfield established a foundation in Amara's name, not as a gift, not as charity, but as something built with intention and respect. The Amara Bell Foundation was created to fund legal support and safe reporting channels for domestic workers and household staff who witness abuse, fraud, or danger inside the homes they work in but have no power, no platform, and no protection to speak up. Amara herself was asked to help design it, to make sure it actually served people in situations like the one she'd lived through. People who had proof but no voice, suspicion but no power. Daniel also quietly paid off the medical bills that had been weighing on Amara's grandmother for years, not as a reward, he told her, but because it was simply the right thing to do for someone who had risked everything for a stranger's life. Amara didn't become a billionaire. She didn't marry into the family, despite what a few tabloids tried to speculate in the weeks that followed. What she became was something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. A woman who had proven, in the most public and terrifying way imaginable, that courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a quiet person in a uniform, folding napkins into perfect triangles for 6 months while carrying a secret heavy enough to break most people, simply because she refused to let a good man walk blindly toward his own death. A year later, at the opening of the Foundation's first regional office, a reporter finally got the interview Amara had avoided for so long and asked her the question everyone still wanted answered. Was she afraid, standing there with that vial raised in front of 300 strangers, knowing she could lose everything in an instant? Amara thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I was terrified," she said honestly. "But I was more afraid of staying silent. Of watching something happen and telling myself later that it wasn't my place to say anything. I think most people who do brave things aren't fearless. They're just more scared of regret than they are of the moment itself." And that's the story of the maid who smashed a killer's face into her own wedding cake. Not out of cruelty, not out of jealousy, but out of 6 months of quiet, terrified courage that most people will never fully understand unless they've lived something close to it themselves. The lesson in this one is simple, but it's easy to forget in a world that rewards staying quiet, staying comfortable, staying out of things that aren't your business. Sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do isn't loud or celebrated in the moment. Sometimes it's carrying a truth nobody else will believe, for as long as it takes, until the moment finally comes when the whole world has no choice but to listen. If this story moved you even a little tonight, I'd love for you to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And if you're new here, consider subscribing because we tell stories just like this one every single week. Real emotional stories about courage, truth, and the quiet heroes who change everything when it matters most. And if you know someone who needs a reminder tonight that speaking up matters, that one voice really can change everything, please share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end with me tonight. I'll see you in the next story.